Good evening. It's been a day of fast-paced developments. Late in the evening tonight, there are two huge news breaks which are coming in right now. A massive change in the trajectory of India's relations with China, perhaps the most comprehensive set of agreements between India and China, which have just been announced following the arrival of Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister in India. Not only did he meet the Prime Minister, he also met the National Security Advisor and indeed earlier on the Foreign Minister. But what we are now seeing and what we are now hearing and what we can now share with you are details of what exactly has taken place. And there have been a series of steps, and remember the context of this, a series of steps just ahead of the visit of the Prime Minister to China, which will be his first visit to China in 7 years. This is a huge thaw in the relationship between the two countries. We've got several of the points up on the stage. Now, essentially, the biggest concern between India and China has been the border issue. The big question mark is, are India and China looking to start afresh? The statement that we now have, it's a statement on the meeting between the special representatives Wang Yi and Ajit Doval, says that the need to take a political perspective of the overall bilateral relationship while seeking a fair, reasonable and mutually acceptable framework for settlement of the boundary question in accordance with the agreement on political parameters and guiding principles for the settlement of the India-China boundary question signed in 2005. Now, what this essentially means is that there is consensus after several rounds of talks. These have primarily been talks at the level of military leaders on the ground situation in Ladakh, but there have also been talks at the level of political leaders, specifically Ajit Doval and Wang Yi. Now, those talks have taken place today. They are called special representatives. And what they've now said is that, look, there appears to be a certain trajectory, a certain direction in the relationship. And there is therefore a need to take a political perspective of the overall bilateral relationship. In other words, the Chinese President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi would need to look at what they want of the relationship. What is the goal? It would be to seek a fair, reasonable and mutually acceptable framework for settlement of the boundary question. So India and China once again openly bringing up the need to settle the boundary dispute, which has been the longest standing dispute between the two countries for once and for all. They have alluded to the guiding principles which were set up in 2005. Those guiding principles essentially disappeared when the Galwan clashes took place. But after that, we are now seeing both sides once again talk about the principles which exist, which they want to do to figure out what the relationship can actually have in terms of potential. Shiv Arur with us. Shiv, how do you see these developments?
Vishnu, even the smallest of steps taken between India and China has global repercussions, especially in the current turbulence that both the countries are facing from Donald Trump. This proximity and the manner in which both countries have managed to make significant and visible and measurable headway, both in terms of air travel, both in terms of trade, in terms of visas to be given to tourists and professionals, the scale of Indian pilgrimage to be increased, first talk of de-escalation after Galwan, at a time when the two countries, let's remember, continue to be in a full multi-division level strength deployment in eastern Ladakh, is massive forward progress for the two countries. Ahead of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in China at the end of this month, the pressure was always going to be on both sides, to be able to arrive at some reasonable mutual deliverables that can be representative of the two countries managing to move past very, very stubborn frictions of an economic and strategic nature and put something on the table that gives them some next steps. And I think This big story that you're breaking here on NDTV definitely represents that, because not only does it directly address the border question in terms of looking, or at least agreeing to look for a mutually beneficial and reasonable solution to a long-standing question, but also talks about de-escalation of troops over 5 years after the standoff actually began, Vishnu. And that is no small feat. We do know, as you and I have both reported, that India and China have, in fits and starts, conducted some small disengagements in terms of troop pullbacks. But de-escalation and a larger de-induction of troops is still a faraway castle as far as both countries are concerned. And that's where the real challenge has lain. Infrastructure build-up has continued on both sides. But with both of them now talking about de-escalation, I think it opens the door towards, a larger dynamic between the two countries facing what they are at this time with the United States. It must be said, however, that India is not walking into a new sort of friendship. Let's remember, China was deemed a combatant by the Indian Army during Operation Sindoor as well. So this is a country that India does not trust. But I think mutual alignment based on current dynamics, this is massive progress.
No, Shiv, and just going through this statement, there's another part which strikes me as being one of the most important ones. For our viewers, they might look at air travel, direct flights being resumed, easy visas for tourists and business women and businessmen to be, takeaways, border trade in those three places. I actually see that as being smaller to the following statement, which I think reflects that there is a political will on both sides now to fix it. So very cautiously, what we are saying, and I quote, is this: they agreed that a stable, cooperative and forward-looking relationship between India and China is in the mutual interest of the two countries to realize their development potential fully. They further agreed that both sides should earnestly implement the important common understandings reached between the two countries and promote sustained, sound and steady development of India-China relations. So we are now actually looking at the next step. We are looking at both sides having established a series of mechanisms to deal with the one issue which we've been unable to resolve in all of these decades. That is the issue of the border and the boundary. But what both sides are now saying is that, look, we need to work with each other, and that statement is very clear. And Shiv, let's reflect and let's talk a little bit about what this means for the geostrategic churn internationally. Obviously, this is not something that America is going to like, but it's happened very fast. America has imposed 50% tariffs. India and China are now talking. Whenever there is a vacuum in international relations, one side or the other seeks to fill it. China has come to the table and they clearly want to talk. They clearly want to fix things. That's how I see these developments today. Your thoughts?
You're absolutely right, Vishnu. I completely agree. And I think, when it comes to the India-China relationship, every strategic cliche applies very strongly. For one thing, there are no permanent friends or enemies. There are only permanent interests. Is something that couldn't be more spoken loudly than it is today in terms of what India and China are actually doing. Not at the risk of repeating myself, two countries that were in a conflict, were in a warlike situation until 3 months ago, in a combat scenario, a very real one during Operation Sindoor, are now shaking hands and talking about breaking bread, making peace, sending tourists to each other's countries, increasing pilgrimage, people-to-people contact, trade, economy, military, boundary, all of those things. This is an incredible amount of cordiality. And like someone said a short while ago on social media, geopolitics is not for beginners, but that's really how quickly things can actually change. Should this sudden accelerated realignment be owed to Donald Trump alone? I don't think so. As you and I have both reported, I think India and China have been attempting, to create the space for some kind of a proximity to settle the boundary dispute, to get together on other issues. You've broken several pieces of news, including on the rare earth that you had on your show earlier as well. So all of these show that there certainly is a meeting of minds at the leadership level, but the issue of trust continues to hang in the air, as you well know. China is not a country that India trusts, but many people say trust is an overrated virtue when it comes to diplomacy and strategic relationships. So what this really is creating the space for synergies, creating the space for mutual dependences. There's nothing better than that, better to do that than trade and people-to-people contact. And after 5 years of what has largely been friction between the two countries, I think the changes in the world that have been so dramatic thanks to Donald Trump have just made some of these movements a little easier, Vishnu.
I'm just going to go through a few of the other points over here. When we began talking, Shiv, I spoke about how both sides were now looking at Prime Minister Modi, President Xi to take that final call based on what they'd both agreed on to work towards improving the status of the relationship. But here's another part, and I think this is the big issue, obviously, which has affected both countries. Setting up an expert group, right? We already have a working mechanism for consultation and coordination, but there'll be another expert group that will explore an early harvest in boundary delimitation in India-China border areas. So they are now saying that we've got all sorts of mechanisms. Let's now sit on a table and work out an early harvest. In other words, low-hanging fruit. That's how I interpret the words early harvest, to try and find a solution, a delimitation of the boundary, a definition of the boundaries itself. Another working group under another existing body to manage peace and tranquility. Another working group, the creation of a general level mechanism in the eastern sector, that's Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim, and the middle sector, in addition to the existing mechanisms that exist, right? More talk, more conversations, and early meeting of general level mechanisms in the western sector. So they want to talk at the level of Sikkim, at the level of Arunachal Pradesh, and at the level of Kashmir and certainly Ladakh. The use of border management mechanisms at diplomatic and military levels to carry forward the process of border management and discuss de-escalation, beginning with the principles and modalities thereof. So this is an absolutely huge series of steps which have taken place. It comes just days ahead of the visit of the Prime Minister to China. This will be his first visit to China in 7 years after the Galwan crisis. It is fair to say that India and China are resetting our relationships in what will be a relationship hopefully for the future. But on the entire issue of trust, on the entire issue of the boundary, will there be a genuine solution that works for Beijing and certainly for New Delhi? For New Delhi is our priority. Will it work for us? Let's wait and see.